Hello, my name is Jim Gurman, and welcome to today's episode of
Kilimanjaro.
Today we're going to be taking a look at the Festool Kapex KS 120 EB compound miter saw. Now, in the interest of full disclosure, Festool does not pay me. They do not sponsor this channel. However, I have won a few contests from Festool that have helped get some of the various Festool stuff that I have here. Now, I will say that I do like Festool in general. However, you'll see, at least I hope you'll see that I try to be as unbiased as possible with this review and with all of my reviews. So with that out of the way, let's take a look at some of the features of the saw itself. Now, typical of a compound miter saw, the carriage slides back and forth and it pulls down, so you can pull it out, drop it down, come back. The whole thing twists for your bevel cuts. It goes to 45 degrees in this direction, and it'll go up to 60 degrees in the other direction. It locks at a fair number of handy detents, like 22.5 degrees, 31.6 degrees, that sort of thing. But by pushing this down, it'll lock it in place anywhere that you want. So if you want, 16.5, lock it in place. Pretty quick and simple, pretty standard stuff. It's got a nice little gauge here. You can see exactly what angle you're at, and there's even a little half-degree mark, which is pretty nice. In addition, it tilts on both sides. There's a lever back here. Swing it like this. There's a lever back here that you can see that flips up and down. And then when it's up, you just turn this knob and it tilts back and forth. There's a positive stop at 0, and then there's another one at 45, plus minus 45, 47. There's a knob back here that you can adjust that way. In addition, the fences slide back and forth. It's pretty typical on a miter saw. They slide pretty nicely, and there's a nice quick release lever here, so that's pretty quick and easy. There's also this really nice clamp to clamp your workpiece down. Holds it nice and solid. It's quick, easy to do. However, they only give you one of them. For a saw that costs almost $1,500, I don't understand why they didn't just throw in another one. You can buy another one, but it seems like something they should have just came with. Now, for transport, one of the things that they've done is they've made it so that you can lock the saw. In the back here, there's a knob where you just turn that, and it prevents it from going back and forth. Except the knob's not green. Everything on Festools that turns is green. There's even this little knob here, which isn't green, has a little green arrow. This knob in the back, not green. Don't know what happened there. However, if you want to lower the saw to transport it, you can also push it down, and there's a knob right here that will hold that in place. So that's great, keeps it nice and tidy. There's a nice cord carrier back here that keeps the cord all nice and tidy, makes it really easy to move it around. Now, that being said, one of the things that you may have noticed about this saw is that it's not the biggest saw in the world. It's not a 12-inch saw, which is pretty typical of most compound miter saws. It only has a 10-inch blade. Now, there's a couple reasons for that. The first reason is that it makes it smaller, it makes it lighter, it makes it easier to use and transport. And the other big reason, and I'll get to this in a little bit later, is that it prevents the blade from wobbling as much. With a bigger blade, if it's a little out of balance, it'll tend to wobble a little bit. If there's a little bit more run out in the bearings, that'll wobble a little bit more, and that'll make your cut not as accurate. One of the other really nice features about this saw is the laser light that it has that helps you align the cut. Now, this is something that I saw on the New Yankee Workshop many years ago, and I thought it was the best thing ever. However, when I first used the saw with a laser, I was really disappointed. The laser wasn't really nice and sharp, it wasn't aligned properly, and it was only on one side of the blade. The Festool fixes all of those problems. To turn it on, there's a little button back here that you push, and then it puts the laser light down on both sides of the blade. Now, it's a nice fine laser, so it really helps you align your cut properly, and it's a nice bright laser. Now, I have some really bright lights here to help with the video, and you can still see the laser without a problem. So the only problem with this implementation is that it comes from the factory aligned almost perfectly. And I say almost, at least that was on my saw, because it's good enough for most things, but every once in a while I've had it where I lined it up real nice and it wasn't on like exactly right. You can fix that. Up here on the top here, there's little instructions that say that you can punch through this sticker and then you can adjust some screws to adjust the laser light to be exactly right on. It's nice that they let you do that. I don't understand why they made it so that you have to punch through this sticker to do that. It's something that, it's a nice expensive tool and you have to punch through one of their labels to adjust it. I just don't understand it. You can apparently get a replacement sticker if you really want to, but still it's a questionable design decision. I don't understand why they didn't just put like a cover over here that you can move out of the way to adjust it, or something else, some other way of covering up those holes. So that's a little disappointing. One thing that works really well with the laser is this angle measurement tool that they provide. Now it comes with the Kapex, but you can also buy it separately, so if you want to use it with some other compound miter saw that you have, you can just buy it and use it with that. However, what it is it's a really nice tool to measure angles. Now if you're doing crown molding or baseboard or something like that, most of the time your walls are going to be at 90 degrees, except when they're not. Now they could be almost at 90 degrees or they could be significantly off. Either way, this is going to come in really handy. So if you're doing an inside corner, you just put this up against the corner, you tighten it down to whatever angle you're at, then you can put it on here and adjust this so it lines up with your cut. Now if you just want to make a butt cut, you can just line it up with one of the edges here, or if you want to split that cut to make a miter, you line it up with this nice line in the center here. Now if you're doing an outside cut, these arms here extend, and then you can put that over your outside miter, do the same thing. Really nice, really handy to use. It makes it a lot easier to get your miters nice and tight. And it folds up and slides in here for nice convenient storage. The Kapex has great horizontal cut capacity. It'll cut a board that's 12 inches wide without a problem. Now some of the bigger 12-inch diameter saws will cut boards that are 14, even 15 inches wide, but 12 inches is extremely useful. Those extra couple inches aren't all that critical. Where this saw does fall down, because it's only a 10-inch saw, is its vertical cut capacity. Now if you have a thin piece of like baseboard or something like that, you can usually sneak it behind the blade, get it back here, and back there it's got about a 4-inch, 4.5-inch cut capacity. Most of the time though, if you're cutting a thicker piece of wood, it'll hit the arbor here, and then you can only cut something that's about 3.5 inches. So that's significantly worse than a lot of the 12-inch saws. A lot of the 12-inch saws you could sneak a like 6.5-inch board back there, and you can get like a 4.5-inch, nice thick board in. So that's where the 10-inch really comes in as a limitation on the saw. All right, I've got my safety glasses on because we're going to fire up the saw and make a cut. There's two things to pay attention to when I'm making the cut. The first is how well the dust extraction works. Miter saws are notoriously difficult to get all the sawdust that's generated picked up. However, Festool tries really hard with all of their tools to get as much sawdust as possible. So they've got this little rubber boot here that helps pick up the sawdust, and they suggest that you hook it up to a shop vac or one of their own dust extractors. So today I'll be using it with just a regular old cheap shop vac, not a Festool one. Now this one has a slightly smaller hose than the big hose that goes with the Festool ones, so it's not going to do as good a job, but you can still see that it does a pretty good job picking up the sawdust. Festool claims that the saw will collect 91% of the sawdust that's generated. I think that's actually a little low, particularly with the Festool shop vac. It'll generally pick up almost all of the sawdust, but it still does leave a fair bit around. It's a lot, but it's still enough that at the end of the day, there's going to be sawdust next to the saw and around in your work area. But it should make cleanup a lot easier. The other thing to pay attention to is how well the motor's doing. Now, it'll be a little hard to hear over the shop vac, but try and pay attention to see if the motor's bogging down. I'm going to try and make the cut pretty quickly, and that should be a fair assessment of how strong this motor is. So the motor is a 12-amp motor. I've actually measured it at up to 16 amps. That's pushing it for a household circuit, so you couldn't really put a stronger motor on here. Today we're going to be cutting a 4x4. This is a Douglas fir 4x4, so it's not the hardest wood you could imagine, but it is a fairly substantial piece of wood, so pay attention and see if you can hear it bogging down. So I'm going to put this in here and clamp it down with the handy clamp. Makes it a lot easier to make the cut. Then I'm going to turn on my shop vac, and then I'll fire up the saw. Now to fire up the saw, it takes two actions. You have to push this green button up top and then use this trigger to pull it down. So that's a safety mechanism so you don't accidentally turn on the saw. It's not something that's on most other miter saws, and honestly I found it to be a little bit irritating. It makes it a little harder to use the saw. So it's not something I particularly like, but it does make the saw a little safer. So you can see here that the motor didn't really have much difficulty with the cut. I did make the cut pretty hard. so it did bog a little bit, but the blade rotational speeds did maintain pretty much constant. You can see there is some sawdust around. There's a little bit more back here that you probably can't see, but in general there's not sawdust everywhere, which is great. The other thing to pay attention to is the quality of the cut here. So this cut is pretty much as good as you can get. There's pretty much no saw marks on there. It's a little hard to see on the camera, but you can't see any saw marks, which is something that is one of the big benefits of this saw. Now they've gone through some of the features of the saw and how well it works, let's talk a little bit about the fit and finish of the saw and how it is to use on a day-to-day basis. So in general, the fit and finish, like with most Festools, is extremely good. Now I say in general because there are some areas where it falls down. The biggest one of this is the casting. Now this aluminum base here is a very complicated casting. If I flipped it over, you could see there's a ridiculous number of webs that are here to keep its strength while still being a nice light casting. But the casting has a lot of voids down here along the part line. It looks really crummy. So that's not something I'd like to see from a saw that costs almost $1,500. They really should have cleaned up all this when they finished it before they painted it. Now the paint, I'm not sure if it's paint or an epoxy paint or just a powder coat that's on here. It's really nice. It feels nice and durable. It's a little smooth, so things slide nicely. Everything that's supposed to move on the saw moves really nicely. This fence slides really nicely. Sometimes on the DeWalt miter saws, these fences are kind of a pain to move. Almost everything that is supposed to move is toolless. The only thing that takes a tool is the blade. And everything that's supposed to move is this nice green color, except a couple things that I guess Festool forgot that they usually make parts that move green, like this handle here and this knob back here that I mentioned previously. So that's generally good, but it's a little, I don't know why they did that. So the saw slides really nicely through here. It turns really nicely for tipping, and it's nice that you don't have to reach back to adjust it for the tip mechanism, except you do because you have to flip the lever that's back here to allow it to tip. So if you're making lots of cuts though, you can just leave that lever up and then it's a little easier to use. Personally, I've never found reaching behind the saw to be a big deal to tip it, but I don't know, I have pretty long arms, maybe some people have more difficulty with that. So they seem to have gone to a lot of lengths to try to make the saw portable. They have a nice cord carrier on the back, which is really nice, but it's still kind of awkward. There's no really, there's two supposed to be handles on the side here. They don't really work real well, I found, to carry it. The DeWalt saws that I've used in the past have a nice handle up here that's right at the center of gravity, makes it nice and easy to carry. This one's a little harder to carry like that. So despite the saw being light, I've always found it a little bulky and cumbersome to carry. Now some of the things that Festool, they typically use to justify their high price is the nice sustainer that the tools come with. It's a really nice box that the tools come with, and it adds some significant value to the tool. This doesn't come with that. It's obviously too big to put in a box, so there's no added value there. The other thing is the plug-it cord that the Festools come with. I find that really useful. You don't have to keep unplugging to the outlet and stuff. The cord is right there, and you can switch them very easily, but this doesn't have that. I think that's because this tool was probably designed before Festool came up with that system, or it was designed before they came up with the heavy-duty version of it, because this tool does pull a lot of power. So it's not really a big deal. It's not a tool you're unplugging and plugging in all the time, so it's not a big deal, but it is something that I was surprised to see. So now for the elephant in the room, is it worth the money? It's extremely expensive. It's 2 or 3 times more than any other saw that's on the market. And what do you get for that money? Well, you get a nice laser that is aligned pretty well. You get this one clamp that you can usually just buy. You get the fancy miter gauge. You can buy that separately. You don't get as much cut capacity as a lot of the 12-inch saws. So generally, I don't think it's worth it. If you're going to be doing general framing work, general sort of contracting work, it's not worth it. There's no real benefit to the saw. It's a little lighter. Maybe it's a little easier to carry if you're moving it from all the time. Honestly, I don't think that's worth it. The only thing that is here that really makes this saw worthwhile is the cut quality. So if you're doing fine finish trim, something that's not, something that's stain grade, you're not going to be painting it, those miters need to be spot on and they need to be perfect. A lot of the times a DeWalt or a Bosch saw, they're not going to be perfect. I've run into problems where I've made 2 or 3 cuts and each one is off by just a little bit, and you'd never notice it unless it's going together real nice and tight, and then there's a little gap there. Now, if you're doing framing, doesn't matter in the slightest. But if you're doing something like that, some real nice crown molding or working on fine furniture, it's something that could matter. That's why a lot of guys who are doing furniture will use their table saw to make miter cuts instead of using a chop saw like this. So that is where this saw really stands out, and that can be where it will make up for its high cost. The cut quality on it is excellent. You're not going to have to touch up that cut. It's going to be perfect. And that can make it worth the money. If you're the kind of guy who's doing that on a day-to-day basis where the time saved from using a good quality saw is going to pay for itself, then it's going to pay for itself and you'll end up making more money with this saw. There's also times where it's the only saw that's going to do the work. If you need to make a perfect cut, the DeWalt saw is not going to work for you. You need something better, so you can either use this, you can use a hand trimmer, you can make a hand cut, or you can cut it on a table saw. A lot of those options aren't very practical on a job site, so that's when you need a saw like this. So that being said, I think that's a fairly unbiased view. I'm sure people are going to disagree in the comments. There seems to be a lot of hate for Festool just, because it's Festool, but I think in general this saw is not worth the money unless you really need that cut quality. There's two last things I want to talk about with the Festool Kapex. The first is how reliable it is. Now in general, trying to figure out how reliable a tool is extremely difficult. Really the only people who know are the company that makes the tool. Everybody else is just kind of speculating. If you look at forums, you can try and figure out how many times people are complaining about them breaking, but that's a little hard to do because you don't know how many tools are actually out there, and people only talk about a tool when it breaks, so it's very difficult to compare that way. The other thing you can do is look at it, pull it apart, look at all the components. That's not foolproof either, because some components that you think might be well over designed, they end up not being. And then there's other components that you think might be undersized, they could actually be just fine. It's very difficult to tell. So that being said, I do think, based on particularly the Festool Owners Group forum, that there are probably more issues with this saw, particularly than with any of the other Festools. It does seem like there's a fair number of people that are complaining about them breaking for various reasons. Now, to counter that, Festool does have probably the best warranty in the business. It's 3 years. They are extremely helpful if you have any problems with it. But that only does you any good if, well, you don't need the saw while they're off fixing it, or while you're in the warranty period. Once the warranty's over, you're out of luck, which can be a real bummer if it's 3 years and a day and your $1,500 saw craps out. So that's something to keep in mind. And then the other thing is a safety issue that I've had with this saw that some people seem to have, some people don't seem to have. And that's if you make a small cut with the saw and you pull the blade back up while it's still spinning, sometimes it'll kick the piece into here and then it can bounce back and hit you. People have said that you can adjust the cut to try and get rid of that. I've adjusted it as much as I can, fiddled around with it, and it still happens from time to time. So it's generally not a big deal. If you're cutting something of any substantial size, it doesn't do it. It's only if it's a small piece. As long as you have your safety glasses on, it doesn't come back at you hard enough that it's ever going to hurt you. But it is something to keep in mind. Thanks for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. If you have any questions or comments about any of the features of the saw or any of the review, please let me know in the comments below. There are a couple things I skipped over that I don't think really matter about the saw, so if there's one of those features that you really love, feel free to let me know below. I'd love to see you subscribe to the channel. I try to post new tool reviews or other tool instructional videos every 2 weeks or so.